Thank you very much, Jesse. So over the last couple of years, since the Trump administration launched what some have called its tech Cold War against China, Chinese-made drones have gotten what you might call the Huawei treatment here in the United States. Putative concerns over national security have prompted some American lawmakers to introduce in the fall of 2019 a bill that would bar U.S. federal agencies from purchasing drones made in China or containing components made in China, certain components. And just this month in March, or this last March, a draft executive order calling for basically the same ban on Chinese-made drones was leaked to Politico. And we've gotten a chance to look at that. Pressure from Congress and from the Trump administration has resulted now in the grounding of all drone flights that are conducted by agencies like the federal agencies like the Department of the Interior, which used drones, as you'll see, for a huge, wide range of very important tasks. So I am Kaiser Kuo from the Sinica Podcast on SupChina, and we're here to talk about this and to talk more broadly about the challenges and perhaps even the opportunities of Chinese businesses doing business in the United States in these very difficult times. So joining me is Brendan Schulman, who is Vice President of Public Policy and Legal Affairs for DJI, which is the world's biggest consumer drone manufacturer. It's headquartered in Shenzhen. Previously, Brendan was head of unmanned aircraft systems practice, so the unmanned aircraft systems practice at the law firm of Kramer Levin in New York City, and he is a member of the Federal Aviation Administration's Drone Advisory Committee. Brendan, welcome. Thanks for taking the time.
Oh, thank you very much. Great to be here.
So let's start with some of the basics about the company that you work for, DJI. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with it, talk about your products, a bit about the history of the company, your turnover, your share of the market in the consumer drone space, or however you define the segment that you're in. Tell us a little bit about DJI.
Happy to. You know, we're really the innovators in the field. We've been the market leader for as long as there's been such a thing as a consumer drone. And it's really important to understand we're not talking about giant military systems. We're talking about something like this. This is one of our most recent products, the Mavic Mini. So it's basically a camera that happens to fly. And over the past few years, the ability to put photography into the hands of artists, hobbyists, professionals to get an aerial perspective is really something that's fascinated a lot of people. And so what started off being a consumer-driven technology has been adopted by increasing numbers of government agencies and also companies to do amazing work, including life-saving operations. So where we've been in the market really for the past 15 years is the leading company. We don't really publish our own market share statistics, but those who study our market would tell you we have probably about 70-75% of the market for these kinds of things, which are not tiny toys, and they're also not large military systems.
So you couldn't mount a Hellfire missile on that and take out Qasem Soleimani? No.
I would not advise trying to do that. And the origin of the story is really fascinating. It's very, very similar to Silicon Valley's startup,
right?
But in China. So our founder, Frank Wang, started the company in his dorm room. He, like myself, was a model aircraft enthusiast, and he was fascinated with the idea that you could take remote control model airplanes and helicopters, make them easier to use, put cameras on them that are stabilized, and do something great with it. He started that company in his dorm room at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Now, of course, like many consumer electronics products, they're made and the company's headquartered in Shenzhen.
So was he responsible for a lot of the core IP in these things, for stabilization and for things like that? Or was this stuff that was existing already and that he just managed to make scalable?
No, absolutely. He's the innovator and the originator of the IP. If you look at the iconic first consumer drone that everyone still talks about, even though we haven't put out a new one for a while, that's the DJI Phantom. So that started off, 2010, 11 era. We added functionality to that. This is before I was at the company. I've been at the company 5 years. But again, Frank's innovation, the reason there is an affordable and capable quadcopter or consumer drone is Frank and his innovations that he brought to radio control technology going back over a decade at this point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, you're an American. I'm an American also. I have worked at a Chinese company, and it was a company that had its fair share of controversy surrounding it. I worked at Baidu as director of international communications. I'm curious how, as an American, you felt like you came to trust this company that you work for. Did you come into it with certain suspicions? I mean, I certainly did. I had to ask a lot of very, very candid and maybe even offensive, tactless questions, and to really make them open the kimono before I could get comfortable. So tell me about that process for you, and what was it?
I did not have hesitations in terms of the issues
Right.
that are constantly in the news now about this company in terms of data security. It was very clear to me at the time that I joined, 2015, this was the company that was making the best products at affordable price points and was going to be the market leader by far just on the virtue of the technology. And so when I joined, it was the opportunity coming out of that unmanned systems group that I created at the law firm in New York to join the market leader and to advocate for reasonable and appropriate regulation on the things that most people worry about when it comes to drones, which are things like aviation safety, physical safety. Is someone going to get hurt? Is the drone going to take a picture that invades your personal privacy, not national security, but your backyard? That kind of a question. Legal questions about property ownership, airspace, who owns the air above your backyard. Those are fascinating questions that we all need to work together to resolve, and that I've spent the past really 7 or 8 years going back to the law firm trying to help people resolve. So to me, this was an amazing opportunity. Now, the Chinese component of it was just fascinating to do this kind of work internationally, to learn about the way the technology is actually developed and made around the world, and also to advocate this way, not just in the United States, but around the world. And the company's put me in the position to do that. Now, I've come to trust the company because I've seen and worked with people who are our corporate leaders, including on technology innovations. So some of the things that we've done to help address those safety or security concerns include things like remote ID, geofencing, knowledge testing. We've made our products.
Dig into that a little bit. Geofencing means, just for example, you're simply not able to fly it near an airport, for example, or near military facilities. Is that correct?
Right. So one of the things that attracted me to the company 5 years ago was the priority it places on safety and trying to be proactive to solve that obvious problem of a drone interfering with an airliner or even a helicopter or a private plane. And so going back before my time, we've had geofencing. What geofencing is the drone has a GPS receiver, just like your car or your cell phone. So the drone knows where it is in the world. And DJI has programmed locations that are obviously sensitive or high risk, like airports, nuclear power plants, military bases, prisons. When I came to the company, I wanted to do more. So I said to DJI, let's refine and make that system more robust, including a live updating system. Let's include places that aren't currently covered in our system. And the company very willingly wanted to do that, wanted to be a contributor to safety and security, not just for the United States, but around the world. So everything I've seen in the company since I joined is we want to solve the problems. We want to be a good partner with the government, including on problems that are or concerns that are raised by the United States government, for example, remote identification. So that is the idea that all the drones flying around need to be identified. We need effectively a license plate for them so that we know who's flying them and we can hold people accountable if they're flying them the wrong way or in the wrong place. We're the first company that helped develop, actually did deploy a solution to that, as was envisioned by both the US Congress and the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and other US agencies. So we're trying to proactively solve problems. And that is one reason I have come to trust the company from the inside. Another is a really interesting story that goes back a few years now. So we had one of the most dramatic incidents that happened during my 5 years here at DJI is the day we woke up to learn that one of our drones, it actually was a Phantom 4, collided with a helicopter, a US Army helicopter, over New York City, right over the harbor. And first we thought maybe this was not a real event. Turned out it was, and in fact, a piece of the drone was still stuck in the helicopter. And so we worked together with the National Transportation Safety Board. The motor that was left behind had a serial number. Because the customer who bought that drone from us, bought it from us, not from Amazon or Best Buy, we had the purchase information. So we knew who bought the drone, and we had their DJI account information. So here's kind of the picture of what's happening inside the company in September of 2017 is we're panicking, right? That for the first time, our product has hit a helicopter, and we're worried about the impact on the company, the regulations, the industry as a whole. And we desperately want to find out what happened. What did this customer do with our drone that caused this collision? And so the problem is we didn't know, because we did not have the customer's flight data. We did not have pictures, because we don't automatically collect information, and this customer did not share that information with us. Right. So contrary to these allegations, we know from the story 3 years ago, and I've seen it from the inside, that even if we desperately wanted or had a need to find customer information about what they're doing with our drones, we simply don't have it unless they send it to us. And so, conclusion in that case was that NTSB had to go to the customer and get the customer to synchronize the flight logs to the system, and then we could help the NTSB analyze it and figure out what happened in that case, which was that the customer was flying like 3 miles away from where they were standing and didn't even see the helicopter. So we helped solve a government problem, and in that process, I learned what was confirmed, and this is before all this policy and media pressure on cybersecurity and DJI, is that we very much did not have the data that we are now and continue to be accused of automatically collecting and sharing with the government of China, which is just not true. And I know that firsthand from the inside.
Let's get now right into that. These are the present woes that we were talking about. Allegations that DJI drones, other Chinese-made drones, share user information. That their streams are actually somehow accessible either to the company or to Chinese intelligence or to law enforcement or what have you. Talk about how this all got started with the U.S. government. When did these suspicions arise? I mean, I remember in our previous conversation, you were telling me about how there was an internal memo at the Los Angeles office of the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Agency. And where did it go from there? How did it escalate into something that's now before Congress and a draft executive order?
I think it started with the military. As our consumer products became obviously useful in military operations in the field, our armed forces would buy them off the shelf and take them using their own credit cards. And our products were not created to meet military specifications on security or anything else, and are not advertised or marketed to that military market. And yet they're being used. I think it got to a point where any off-the-shelf product would be a concern from the Department of Defense. And that led, I would say, the very first memos, if you will, were from the Army and Navy saying, these are not secure products, and of course they're not, therefore don't use them unless there's a waiver exemption, you go through a process. That totally makes sense. And it also, of course, makes sense that the U.S. military want to use U.S. products. Right. Fast forwarding a little bit to the memo you mentioned, that sort of military intrigue with the Chinese products used by the U.S. military, I think, prompted others to take a look at it. And the Immigration and Customs Enforcement memo was from, our understanding is that a single person in the LA field office drafted that as a draft. It was not reviewed by Washington headquarters. It was not finalized. It was not released. It cites an unknown source in the industry. Maybe that's a competitor who's trying to hurt us. And yet, when it was leaked, it was assumed to be and has been reported and cited by policy members, including members of Congress, as if it were the findings of the agency, which it's not. So a lot of this stuff is just mythological. It's snowballed. But I think it comes from a kind of obvious need for a military agency to have a military-grade product, which is not what we have to offer.
Let's talk about what that snowball has now become. What are the challenges that you're now faced with? And where are they? I mean, I mentioned in the intro that the Department of the Interior and other federal agencies have now been forced to ground drones. So is that where we're at?
For one agency, we are, and that's, I think, a tragic story for the United States, because that, the Department of the Interior by far has the most sophisticated and impressive unmanned aircraft systems or drone program in the non-military government, and that's worldwide. They were doing amazing things with drones, firefighting, fire prevention, search and rescue of hikers and people lost in the parks, nature conservation, fishery, wildlife management. And they came to us and they said, look, we're the federal government. We need to address security issues. We said, great, let us, it's not a big market for us, one agency, but tell us what we can do for you, and we'll work together. We worked for 15 months. We developed a product that met their specifications. They validated it. They had a third-party company validated it. DHS, CISA validated it through the Idaho National Laboratories. They announced it. This is a product we can safely use from a security point of view in our operations, like the ones I mentioned. Mm-hmm. And move forward a few months, Secretary comes out and says, no, we're going to ground all of the drones because they contain Chinese components. So we had an innovative program and a product that met their security needs, and yet it was grounded. That's one example, I think, of the dramatic impact this is starting to have on beneficial operations, including operations that save American lives and property. There are other proposals out there that are similar or would have a similar impact. There's legislation that would force all federal agencies to stop procuring or using drones that are made in China or potentially have Chinese components. There's, as you mentioned, the leaked executive order draft, which would do that, and also prohibit anyone from flying a drone over federally managed lands. Wow. I guess that could include the post office, as well as using grant money for the purchase of these products. Now, when you think about it, what's special about drones? If you're going to look at components and a country of origin approach, why not the webcam I'm using, right? Why not your phone? This is specific to drones.
By the way, the webcam and the phone actually do transfer data, right?
Well, and so that's the point. What is the drone? It's a flying camera, right? So that the user controls what it takes a picture of. That could be your backyard. That could be something sensitive. And if it's something sensitive, use a product that you trust, or don't send the data to places where you're worried, or use the products offline. This is not internet 5G devices. These are flying cameras. So you can mitigate it as a user by simply deciding what to take pictures of, not connecting it to the internet ever if you want. And then, of course, for DOI, we produced this government edition, which was validated as working for them because it did what they wanted. It didn't transfer data.
Even if you wanted it to. I mean, it's simply incapable of transmission of data, the government edition one. Right?
So look, stepping back, it's clear to me that the policies, whether they're the one that's in place at DOI or the proposals in the Congress or the executive order, they're political in nature. They have nothing to do with the actual security of a Chinese drone product. We're part of obviously a greater context here, the trade war and other geopolitical issues that are bigger than us. And of course, the fact that we are by far the market leader in a high-tech category makes us a very interesting target of various policy proposals, but they're clearly driven by politics, given that the security issues have been addressed to the extent anyone's asked us to address them for the U.S. federal government and for others.
Surely you have some allies, though, here in the United States, even within government. I'm sure there are industries that not just the federal agencies who would clearly benefit from this, or who would find it, incredibly inconvenient to have to ground their drone programs, or to not explore that as an avenue. I mean, they think of everything from even commercial delivery. People have long talked about using drones to make deliveries. So, are e-commerce companies on your side? Amazon has many reasons, because a lot of people buy them from Amazon. Maybe not the U.S. Postal Service. You can't fly apparently over them because they're federally managed. But don't worry, because there's not going to be a U.S. Postal Service for very long if President Trump has his way. Surely you have some allies, right?
I think all the people who actually know what drones do and use our products and understand how they work and what they do are on our side. to the extent of they understand that the security issues are a pretext. And when you look at, for example, I think it was Politico did some reporting on that exact point, where there were internal memos going from Fish and Wildlife Service to DOI leadership and U.S. Department of Agriculture memos expressing their views of what these proposals and policies would do to them. They're going to ground training programs. They're going to ground programs that count fish. Like, what is secure about counting fish? They're going to, U.S. Department of Agriculture specifically said, this does nothing, this grounding based on where the drone is made does nothing to solve a security problem, and it interferes and disrupts our mission to do things that are in furtherance of U.S. agriculture interests. Right. So I don't know that there's any need to take sides or say, who's an ally, who's not. The fact of the matter is that the people who are using and putting drones to productive use and want the best technology on the market, which is clearly ours, understand what's at stake and are very disturbed by the impact that these proposals will have on them. And they don't just say it, they really don't say that to us or to the media. They're saying that internally. You can see these internal memos and letters where they are very frustrated that this policy is going to shut down an amazing beneficial program and also not solve any cybersecurity issue.
Well, the very reason that we are doing this on Zoom rather than in person is because, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic that's now still raging, and you're talking to us from the west of the river, but in New Jersey, very near ground zero, or the biggest hotspot for this. Webster Lewin writes, he asks, I've seen videos of how drones are used to discourage people from gathering together to keep social distancing in Nanjing, China, I assume elsewhere. I live in Chatham, New Jersey, and I've seen issues in our Morris County parks with too many people on walking trails, lingering in parking lots and parks, not wearing masks, and our local government has no way of effectively monitoring crowds on our municipal tennis courts. Why can't Governor Murphy, county, and local governments in New Jersey work with your firm to help enforce the governor's executive order, Order 122, related to social distancing and wearing of masks? We really need this here. What would you say to that? I mean, although I got to say, as a PR guy, the optics of a Chinese company helping with sort of this authoritarianism would drive the sort of MAGA hat crowd absolutely bonkers. But what do you say to this?
We've done this. So a few weeks ago, we enacted, so we have a disaster relief program, typically used for things like hurricanes and earthquakes. This is a unique emergency or disaster, but of course it is. And so we activated that program, and we donated 100 drones to police departments and public safety agencies for this very purpose: figure out ways to put drones to use to help in the pandemic, including monitoring gathering places where people might need to be reminded to go home. And one prominent example of that is Elizabeth, New Jersey, was the recipient of one of those drones. They put it to use that way. They spoke about it on the news, and they were immediately attacked. The mayor was attacked, and the police department was attacked for allowing Chinese drones to be used in the city for purposes of monitoring public locations. Or actually, they weren't even monitoring or taking pictures. They were using, not this model, but one of our others has a built-in speaker. You can actually make loudspeaker announcements at a fairly good distance to help facilitate reminders. So it was a really useful tool. They love it. And they were attacked because they were using a Chinese product. And it's sort of an example of that, there's almost nothing we can do. No good deed goes unpunished, right? What if we can't do an act of charity that can facilitate in this exact kind of thing that Webster Lewin is suggesting, which is a great idea? What can we do? It's a really good example. But and look, there may be concerns about surveillance, and I get that. So as you were saying, as a from a PR perspective, I don't know that that's the most sympathetic use, but that's up to the local officials.
That's right.
The added layer here is, it's a Chinese drone. So now we're worried that the data is going to China, which it's not. And what's the data anyway? It's aerial views of public spaces, which are, the Supreme Court has already said there's no privacy interest. There's nothing sensitive about the view of town square from the air. We can all take that picture.
Right. So, I mean, again, we've all got COVID on our minds. What are some of the other ways in which drones might be useful to federal agencies, maybe to FEMA or to the NIH or the CDC right now in fighting COVID-19? Could you see them, for example, delivering a vaccine if and when it comes, or remdesivir, delivering masks to rural areas are now being, severely affected, and a lot of them are quite distant. Thermal imaging, to do remote temperature sensing. I can think of a dozen things just off the top of my head.
You've named some of the top ones we've heard of. So of course we love it when our customers figure out how to put the technology to use and innovate. And those are some of the great things we've heard. Delivery, of course, to the extent you want to take a medical item, a prescription, one day, hopefully soon, a vaccine or a test sample without going near somebody, that's great. Obviously, that's most useful when you can fly long distance, and we have some policy issues we all do as an industry to work out with the FAA in terms of flying long distance. The temperature sensors, we do have a model with a thermal sensor that's made by FLIR, the American company. And I don't know that is accurate enough to diagnose your body temperature, but it seems like it was being used at the Javits Center in New York, not flying, just as a spare thermal camera as people walked in the door when they set up that temporary hospital in New York. So sure, temperature monitoring. We even did a program in China across 1,000 counties of spraying disinfectant. We did that in collaboration with an agriculture university. Again, I'm no expert in how effective that is, but it's the experimentation that leads to innovation throughout human history, including in moments of crisis. And so we really do think that some of these applications will end up being very important long-term, not just in this crisis, but in others. And of course, just the drone is a force multiplier. We have a lot of public safety departments that are short-staffed because people are isolated, quarantined, or sick. And so a drone can help supplement police force, fire department, giving an aerial perspective of where a fire is spreading. Right. Means you need fewer firefighters to fight it. And so there's all the uses that drones already have, including search and rescue, for example, are facilitated by the use of drones. Even if it's not directly related to solving the pandemic, it's certainly helpful because of the pandemic.
In a time where manpower resources are so constrained by the pandemic. Exactly.
Yes.
And when there's so many things that can't be done in person. We have a question from the audience. It says, the American Security Drone Act seems to be based on the premise that DJI drones and other drones are a threat to government users of the technology because they are made in China. Assuming you disagree with this approach, and I assume that you do, and given the geopolitical situation between the U.S. and China, is there an alternative to the ASDA that we should be talking about? I mean, what would you want to see before Congress in its place?
Yes. Look, the issue of securing technology is not new, and it's not unique to drones. In other contexts, the answer is always standards, right? You need to figure out what is the security measure that you need any product to achieve relative to the nature of the operation, because that will differ depending on what type of operation you're doing. And then anyone can, if they want, design a product and test it to that standard. So the right answer to China cybersecurity issues, or really any cybersecurity issue, it is the same answer that exists in the context of other technologies, and that's industry standards. However, again, the drone is unique, right? It is a camera that happens to fly. It doesn't need to be connected. So there may be different considerations, and there is no standard for drone cybersecurity. No one has created that yet. There's some work underway at a number of different bodies to do that, but it'll take time because it is a little bit different technology. It's not sitting in the network in contact with your traffic, your audio visual, or your email traffic. It's a camera, and you decide where to point it, and that alone means that it's different from a lot of IT types of devices. On the other hand, if you do connect it and you do synchronize it in a way that might raise more of a challenge, that might demand a different approach. So standards are the way to solve these problems. It's not, the danger is that if you try to solve the problem with the American Security Drone Act's approach of just looking at where the device or component is made, you've created the cyber vulnerability, because now you're not looking at all of the other products that might be an actual threat and that have not been validated or secured.
Right, right. So I'm curious why it is that the Trump administration feels like it needs to introduce this EO. Is it because they don't believe that the ASDA is going to go through? What is do you have any insight into the rationale of the administration?
I don't have any specific insight. In fact, there was at an earlier stage, there was a OMB guidance provided to Capitol Hill that I think was an earlier version of the American Security Drone Act that said, this is not the right approach. Country of origin does not solve the issue. But I think, as is often the case in any policy-making body, there's competing ideas of how to execute a policy objective, and whether that means waiting for the legislature to go first, or doing something at the executive level, assuming that such policy is authorized and lawful. You can take multiple approaches to the same objective, but I think all of these policy vehicles are basically about achieving the same thing, which is protectionist trade policy, to manipulate the market for drones and create opportunities for American companies that don't have products on the market that are as good as DJI's, ultimately so that one day the US military will have a choice of products on the market. And that makes sense, but giving the military the selection of products that it wants and deserves would, through that policy, come at the cost of hurting other agencies as well as the American public. So if you think about what the real objective here is, it's to change the marketplace so that there is an artificial demand for American products that, at least currently, are not as good and or cost more.
I mean, I imagine you're spending an awful lot of your time working on this and related issues, but relative to the size of this in terms of your market, I can't imagine that federal agency procurement represents a particularly large piece. Why not just say, screw it, okay, forget it, I'm not gonna, we're paying Brendan Schulman this ghastly sum of money, let's not have him work on this anymore, because maybe it's just sort of Barbra Streisand issuing the problem, drawing more attention to it than need be. Why not just focus on, those people who were ordering it to fly it around their backyards and to shoot the local, no more parades, but, to nature scenery and for that low budget movie that we're making.
It has taken up time, and it's unfortunate because as an industry, we have a lot of work to do together, hand in hand, in collaboration with the federal government on things like remote ID, safety, security of the airspace. If we work together, we could achieve a lot more. But we are spending our time addressing these false allegations and responding to policy proposals. You're right that the federal agency market alone is not huge, particularly since we're not pursuing defense contracting opportunities. Like, these are consumer, professional, and enterprise products that government agencies should use, but they're not made for military. So I think the reason it's worth doing is just, I don't want to say on principle, but this is just wrong, right? To have, lawmakers, including agencies that I used to readily talk to about solving problems together, now either not talking to me because of the politics, or in some cases saying things that are just hurtful and untrue, and attacking us for donating drones to try to help with the pandemic. It's just, we can't not respond to false and scandalous allegations that I know to be untrue, because I think there's a cost to innovation as a whole, because we're such a big presence in the market that if we just sort of tacitly suggested that these things are true or that it's okay to say these things, then what does that mean for drone technology? On top of worrying about air safety and personal privacy and getting hurt, and airspace nuisance type things. Now another fear of drones is that they're spying for the Chinese interests. Well, I mean, I got into this industry and into this company to advocate for innovation so that people could do great things with drone technology and live in an environment in which the policy was rational and reasonable, so that Americans and everyone around the world could put the technology to its best use. And that mission is disrupted if we allow irrational policy based on false information to proliferate, even if it's just a small market. So I personally think this is much more important than how big is DJI's market or one agency or another. This is about the drone industry.
I'm glad you're doing this. Listen, you've talked about government edition and you've talked about all these different steps that you've taken for mitigation. We have a question from, maybe it's a redundant one, but from an attendee who asks, what can be done in terms of source code transparency to show there is no backdoor and data is not transferred to the Chinese government? Huawei attempted to run an open lab like this. They have done that in the UK. Their proposal was largely ignored by US lawmakers. And I'm going to get into the parallels or points of departure with Huawei in a bit, but sharing source code, as far as there is source code involved, is that something you've done?
Well, so set aside the second part of the question, which is important as to whether it actually would help, given that this is about politics. But assuming it would help, and I'd like to think that it would on some level, to do some kind of validation. This is a consumer electronics marketplace, and it's hyper competitive. So there's great sensitivity that revealing source code will allow others access to it, and then to create a product that may not be quite as good as ours, but is good enough. Because the real secret sauce behind the drone is not the plastic that it's made of, but it's the camera stabilization, right? This camera in the air is kept very stable. And even though these motors are spinning, all four of them, the aircraft is very smooth and responsive and easy to fly. These are software algorithms that have been refined for more than a decade. And if you just open that up, I think you run the risk of IP theft, and that's great sensitivity. And given that the environment is that people are attacking this company, it seems like it's even more of a risk to make that leap. So I think that's it's always something that could be considered. We did something, I don't want to say it's similar, but when these allegations first came out, and this was around the time that actually was the ICE memo that you referred to, which made crazy allegations about the drone operating with the power off, talking to satellites, facial recognition, that we were targeting infrastructure customers, which is the opposite of the truth. If anything, I think we were not doing enough to get these tools into the hands of enterprise and infrastructure customers who could put them to use. So the ICE memo, if you just read it and knew anything about the company or the industry, you'd laugh at it. But we hired Kivu Consulting, a firm out of San Francisco, to take a look under the hood at the software, do a validation, and their report, which we released a summary of, again, this was about 2 years ago, said the allegations in that memo were untrue. Things we've been saying about control over the data, you get to choose whether to send it, it doesn't automatically go anywhere, refuting the ICE memo. So we did that third-party validation, if you will. And it's kind of interesting because the ICE memo is still cited as being something that must be true, even though, as I explained, it was a draft by one employee in one office that we refuted with a security analysis, and yet it sort of didn't help. So there's this risk of exposing technology, and then there's the question of what is the benefit in this environment. And look, we talk about these things all the time. Maybe one day that's something we would do. It's always a question of risk and benefit.
Let's talk about the parallels, if there are any, if you agree that there are any, to companies like Huawei, most notably, but also to ZTE, or even to ByteDance, which makes TikTok, of course, or when a Chinese company acquired Grindr. I mean, I can see a case for not wanting a Chinese company knowing a lot of intimate personal secrets about, especially in the gay community in America, where there's still some maybe blackmail possibility, although that I see is fortunately decreasing. What parallels are there? Do you think it's a fair thing to say you're getting the Huawei treatment?
I think on a political level, it feels similar, but I think you know, on a corporate level, we could probably spend another hour talking about differences. I mean, you know, from my perspective, this company was founded by Frank in school as a young engineer. You know, I've worked with Frank now for 5 years. You know, the history and the focus on the innovation is very different, I think, from other things you might be concerned about out there. And the product is fundamentally different. So this is not an internet or social media app. It's also not telecom infrastructure.
Right.
Understandably, those kinds of products interact with data that might be considered not just personal, but highly sensitive. The drone takes pictures of what you want to take pictures of. So it's not within reach of your bank account or your, you know, your personal social media messages to people you are involved with, either business or romantically. So it does, like, the comparison doesn't make sense except in this sort of shortcut way of saying we're of interest politically because we're a leading company in a technology industry and we're based in China.
Right. What lessons do we have? I mean, so there's obviously the possibility that it's one of your rival companies here that's driving that. There are some drone manufacturers in America, but none with nearly the market size that you have. You guys are headquartered in Shenzhen, and Shenzhen is just it is the supply chain. It sits atop the entirety of the supply chain for all components, for almost all IoT devices, for advanced technology devices for consumers. And yet, during this age of decoupling, people are constantly talking about bringing supply chains back to the United States. From what you've seen, how hard would that be for a product like the drone? If you were to suddenly, you know, be fired for whatever reason and take up with a drone company here in the United States and wanted to recreate the kind of supply chain to be able to put out a product of that quality at that price, how much of a challenge would that be?
I'm not an expert in that, but I can't imagine it would be possible. I mean, I've been to our offices. I'm sure I've been there at least 20, maybe 25 times over the past 5 years. Obviously this year, not doing much travel, but I've been to the factories 4 times. You know, very good working conditions. Everything is amazing. Some of the automated testing we do on the drones just blew my mind. And you know, but it probably comes down to the supply chain and the availability there. I've seen these young engineers out of school. They work really hard, just like, you know, a lot of people do right out of school. And they'll get the component they need from some source in Shenzhen. They'll put it in, they'll test it, they'll run out to the field, test it, come back, tweak something, go back out. And so all day long, you've got people running up and down the stairs with like drones and drone components in their hands doing tests. And you know, that is an amazing amount of work for a decade. I don't know how you catch up with that.
Right.
I also don't know how you've got the expertise to manufacture at scale. So sure, I think it's possible for an American company to put together some kind of limited quantities of a drone that fly. I mean, it's not hard to make something that flies anymore, but to get the camera and the gimbal, the motors, the flight control, if you want features like geofencing, you want to provide a safe and advanced and easy to fly experience to the customer, that's a lot of catching up to do, and to do it at scale. You know, I think the FAA has like 1.5 million people registered as drone owners. So you know, the scale is that there's sort of already millions of products, and that's people, not drones. So that means there's millions of drones that are out there, and it's pretty advanced technology at this point. It's mature. So I think that would be difficult because the drone is not just a piece, you know, it's not just a Wi-Fi router. It's not just a memory card. It's a flying machine. There are safety implications. You got to get the motors. Putting all that together is actually a fairly complicated endeavor. And I think that's why some of the US companies that have tried over the past decade have struggled to do it. They certainly had an opportunity. 3D Robotics had plenty of VC funding. Even GoPro, with the resources of a public company, struggled. And when they exited the drone market, they cited, yes, intense competition, but also at the time, this is a few years ago, the hostile regulatory environment. In other words, it's sort of hard to make a drone that people want to fly because of all the concern about safety rules.
And GoPro already has, actually. I mean, they manufacture in China.
Well, and that's the other part of it is even a U.S. company that would design something, certainly would be more efficient to manufacture in China. And GoPro and 3DR were doing that. I think 3DR was doing it in Mexico at one point, and then they moved it to China. Mm-hmm. So the manufacturing side for sure can't be easily or maybe at all duplicated here at scale. But then there's the whole vertical integration of being able to run between your design office to the factory, get something done, test it, and back, and do those iterations for a decade. I don't know how you replicate that.
Yeah, I mean, it's virtually frictionless. I mean, if you compare it to what it would take an American company to do the same thing, I mean, if they have a new prototype or tweaks they want to test, given time zone differences, I mean, just calling down they can't just hop on a bike share bike, pedal down 20 minutes to talk to a design shop, to talk to, I mean, to walk into a building full of just nothing but drone components, right? I mean, it's just, anyway. We have another question, which I think is a very interesting one from Olivia Zhang, who is in the audience. With current U.S.-China geopolitics worsening, what's the worst case scenario that DJI is preparing for as a Chinese tech company operating in the U.S.? What would the plan be like? That's not an easy one to answer. I would have dreaded having been asked such a thing, but what's a nightmare scenario for you?
I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I can speak personally. I think that to me, it's like not being able to advocate for innovation, right? Like there's a lot of work we need to do to solve challenges together to get the most out of drones. And if we're not allowed to do that or not welcome to do that, I just think the country is going to be set back vis-a-vis other countries that are not engaged in this sort of political maneuvering. In terms of like worst outcomes, you can imagine some of the legislation just being taken to whatever extreme is permitted by law, and I suppose that's a question that might be open. So I don't think we've put on a whiteboard, here's the worst case. I think we're trying to focus on, addressing security issues like we did with the Department of the Interior, sharing facts about the company and hoping that the rational, fact-based policymakers will understand that never mind the worst case, even the intermediate bad case is actually bad for the United States.
Does DJI have plans at all to become a public company to list, and would they even consider listing on an American bourse now?
Yeah, we don't share our corporate plans like that.
I'd ask.
Yeah, I have no response to that.
Right. So you've identified this problem as fundamentally a political one. A lot of people have talked about how this paranoia about China, the sort of, the anti-China drive, is not something that's peculiar to the Trump administration or even to the Republican Party, but it's become something of a bipartisan issue, that there's some sort of convergence around a harder on China line. Do you think that that is reflected in attitudes toward the piece of legislation that's now before Congress, the American Security Drone Act? Or are you seeing a partisan division in attitudes on that?
Some of the proposals have support from both parties. To the extent someone's agenda is to be tough on China, then I think that those tend to be the policymakers that either jump on board or even have proposed these things in the first instance. I think as this conference has explored all day, there's sort of a fairly broad support for doing something about trade policy with China, addressing other things that are of concern, and whether you call that bipartisan support or not, it's sort of a matter of like what it means to say there's support. I think that certainly the proponents or supporters of these country of origin policy proposals are the same policymakers who have taken a very hard line against China and other things. And to the extent, those views exist in both parties, you've got support from people within both, but that doesn't mean that there's support to the same extent.
Yeah, I understand. Brendan, I mean, what a fascinating conversation. You guys are just such I wouldn't say a canary in a coal mine or anything like that, but I mean, it is something of a bellwether to see, because this is something where I think any fair observer would have to say there isn't a plausible security threat involved here. I have not seen an instance of a company being treated like this where there is less of a basis for any real concern. And so it's almost a good test case to sort of see how the pure politics of it really do play out. So I have no reluctance in wishing you the best of luck. I am actually going to get out there. I mean, what would do you think the Mavic Mini, that's the one I should buy? It's like what, $400 I think on Amazon.
If you're just starting out and you want something that's small and portable and affordable, but gives you a sort of the DJI experience with some really good software, the flight stability, pretty good camera, it's a great entry model. We just announced the Mavic Air 2, which is a little bit bigger, a little more expensive, but has a more professional camera. It will give you, if you're a amateur or even professional photographer and want to not invest in a product that you're going to quickly outgrow, you probably want to look at the Mavic Air 2.
Air 2, okay. I'll wait for that. Is that out yet, or?
Yeah, we just announced it. Yeah, last week.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Let me also let everyone know that this week on Sinica, the podcast that we recorded like 6 weeks ago with you will be out finally. There were a lot of others in that, so a lot of this conversation, if for those of you who missed part of it, can hear it all again with Jeremy participating as well. Jeremy Goldkorn, who is the proud, very, very proud owner of a DJI drone that he flies, he says, almost every day. Brendan Schulman, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Let me thank everybody for joining in and for participating. Some great questions that we got from the audience. And thanks to Paul Craik, to Sam Sachs, to our beloved Jesse, who Jesse has just broken his back to deliver this conference today. So thank you so much, Jesse Emmanuel. And
thanks, Kaiser.
Okay, take care, everyone.